The night I found that little Korean boy crying beside a dumpster in the rain, I had exactly $17 in my purse and nowhere on this earth left to go. 3 days later, 2 men in black suits were standing outside my apartment door at midnight. They weren't police. They weren't asking questions. They were giving me a choice. And the choice they were giving me had nothing to do with law, nothing to do with rights, nothing to do with anything I had ever been taught to believe protected a person in this country. It had to do with power. The kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice because it has never once needed to. I want you to sit with me, right here. Because I have never told this story to anyone, not my sister back home in Lagos, not my pastor, not the woman upstairs who sometimes slips soup under my door when she thinks I'm having a hard week. I have carried this inside my chest for 4 years like a stone I was afraid to put down, because putting it down meant facing everything it cost me, and everything it gave me. My name is Amaka. I am 51 years old. I came to America from Nigeria 17 years ago with a nursing certificate, a borrowed suitcase, and the particular kind of belief that only someone who has never been truly broken carries, that if you work hard enough, keep your head down, and trust God, things will eventually make sense. But let me not start there. Let me start on a Tuesday in October, because that Tuesday is where everything begins. I had been fired. Greenfield Home Care Agency in Queens, New York, 6 years. $11.40 an hour. Gone in one 10-minute conversation with a supervisor who couldn't say my name correctly and never once tried. She said, staffing model changes. She said, position eliminated. She slid a paper across the desk and told me today was my last day. I said, God bless you, and I left. I didn't cry until I was in the elevator. Then I cried until the elevator reached the lobby, and I stopped, because the security guard near the door had kind eyes, and I did not want his pity. I walked to my locker. Someone had already packed my things into a garbage bag. I picked it up without saying a word, and I walked out into a Queens afternoon that smelled like rain coming. I counted my money at the bus stop. $17, that was it, that was the whole number. After 6 years of arriving before sunrise and leaving after dark. After 6 years of holding other people's parents through their last hours when their own families couldn't bear to be in the room. $17 was what remained between me and nothing. I sat on that bench with the garbage bag between my feet, and I did the arithmetic the way poor people always do. Rent due in 12 days. Bank account holding $203. The gap between that and what I owed was not a gap. It was a canyon. The rain started. I didn't move. I was sitting there, staring at the cracked sidewalk when I heard him, a child crying. Not the loud, demanding cry of a child who has dropped something they wanted. This was quieter, more frightened. The kind of crying that happens when someone has been at it for a very long time and is running out of the energy to continue. I looked up. Beside the dumpster at the corner of the building next to the bus stop, tucked into the small shelter the dumpster's lid provided from the rain, was a little boy. He looked about 4, maybe 5 years old. Korean, small, with a thick dark raincoat that was too clean and too expensive for this neighborhood. His shoes, little yellow rain boots, were the kind that cost more than I made in a day. He had no umbrella, no bag. Nothing with him except himself and his tears and a small stuffed rabbit he was pressing to his chest, so hard it looked like he was trying to push it straight through his body. He was completely alone. I looked up and down the street. No parent running, no adult searching, calling a name, no one watching him. Just the rain and the traffic and the city moving past a frightened little child as though he were part of the scenery. Now, I need you to understand something about that moment. I had $17. I had no job. I had a garbage bag containing the entire evidence of 6 years of my working life. Every logical bone in my body said, get on the bus, Amaka. Focus on your own catastrophe. But I am my mother's daughter. And my mother used to say, when God places a child in your path, Amaka, he is not asking for your permission. He is asking for your hands. I got up. I walked over to that dumpster in the rain, crouched down to the child's level, my knees complaining the whole way because I am not a young woman, and I said softly, hey, sweetheart. Are you okay? He looked at me. His eyes were enormous, dark brown and swimming with tears, and behind the tears was something I recognized the moment I saw it. Pure terror. The rain was falling harder now. I could see his small lips had gone pale. His fingers, wrapped around the rabbit, were trembling, and not from cold alone. This child had been out here too long. I said, "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you. Where is your mama?" He pressed himself further back against the dumpster. I didn't reach for him, I didn't try to pick him up. I simply stayed at his level in the rain, close enough that he could see my face clearly in the fading afternoon light. I let him look at me. I let him decide. My mother also used to say, "You cannot rush trust into a frightened heart. You can only make yourself safe enough for it to arrive on its own." I reached into my garbage bag because that is where my life was now. In a garbage bag, and I found the small pack of peanut butter crackers I'd been carrying since breakfast. I opened them and held one out to him on my palm. He looked at the cracker. He looked at my face. He took the cracker. I called 311. I waited on hold. I was transferred twice and explained the situation to 3 different people who all said someone would come. I stood there in the rain for 25 minutes while the sky went dark and the temperature dropped and no one came. The child's lips were turning blue. That was the moment. That single image. A 4-year-old boy with blue lips in a queen's reign, while 3 different government phone operators promised help was coming. That was when the decision made itself. I took him home. I knew exactly how that would look. I am a Black African woman in America. I knew the story that writes itself when a woman who looks like me is found with a child who looks like him. I knew it the way you know certain things in this country, not from a book, but from the bone. But I also knew that blue lips in October rain do not wait for paperwork. I called 911 the moment we were inside my apartment. I told them everything, where I had found him, what he was wearing, that I was a licensed home care professional, that I had brought him inside for his immediate safety, and that I was giving them my full name and address. Then I hung up and looked at him standing in my small kitchen, still clutching that gray rabbit, dripping water onto my linoleum floor. I said, "Okay, let's get you warm." I gave him a bath. I found a large t-shirt of mine that became a nightgown on him, wrapped him in a towel, and sat him on my couch. I made warm milk with a little honey, my mother's recipe for frightened children, and I sat beside him and said nothing. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a scared person is simply take up space near them without demanding anything in return. He drank the milk slowly. After a while, he leaned against my arm. "I need to tell you something now, something I have only said to God and to my sister Ngozi. I had a son once. His name was Emmanuel. He died at 9 months old in Lagos before I came to America. An infection that arrived fast and left nothing behind. I don't speak about Emmanuel often. I carry him in a place inside me that I have learned to walk around carefully, the way you learn to navigate furniture in the dark. You know it's there. You never stop knowing." But sitting on that couch with a small, frightened, silent child leaning against my arm, smelling of my soap and warm milk, I felt Emmanuel close to me in a way that made my whole chest ache. Not with grief, with something older and quieter than grief, with love that had never had anywhere to go. The police came at 9:30. 2 officers. Kind enough, though I could see them assembling a narrative in their minds as their eyes moved around my apartment. The garbage bag in the corner, the second-hand furniture, the second-hand everything. The child in my oversized shirt. I answered every question, clearly, completely. I showed them my professional certifications. I gave them the 911 call timestamp. I was as steady as I knew how to be, which cost me more than they will ever know. They left me with a case number and the child. He cried when they came in, not from relief at being found, from fear. He hid behind me. I noticed that. I tucked it away. I didn't yet understand what it meant. His name, I would learn much later, was Jehoon. That first night, he didn't tell me his name. That first night, he simply slept on my couch while I sat in the armchair across from him, watching him breathe, because I was afraid he would wake in the dark and not know where he was. He whimpered twice in his sleep. Both times I said, very quietly, "It's Amaka, you're safe, it's Amaka." Both times he settled. In the morning, still wrapped in my old blanket, he looked at me from the couch with those serious, enormous eyes. I said, "Are you hungry?" He nodded. I made rice with a fried egg and a small piece of dried fish, because that was what I had, and I put it in front of him wondering whether a Korean child had ever eaten Nigerian breakfast before. He ate every bit. Then he looked up at me and said very softly in slightly accented English, "More, please." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in days. the kind that comes up from somewhere below the ribs without asking permission. I gave him more. By the second day, I knew 3 things about this child. 1, he was more frightened of going back to wherever he came from than he was of staying with me. 2, he understood more English than he initially showed, but he chose his words carefully, the way a child does who has learned that speaking can sometimes make things worse. 3, that stuffed rabbit was the most important object in his world. He would not sleep without it. He held it during meals. When I accidentally knocked it off the couch reaching for the remote, he made a sound I had never heard a child make, not quite a cry, something more primitive, primal. I picked it up immediately and held it out to him, and he clutched it to his chest and rocked slightly. I sat beside him. I rubbed small circles on his back. I said, "I've got you." "I've got you." He looked up at me and said one word, "Halmoni." I didn't know what it meant yet. Later I would learn it means grandmother. On the 3rd day, the men came. Just past 11 at night, I heard them before they knocked, footsteps in the hallway that stopped too long outside my door. My building's hallway light flickers at a rhythm I know the way I know my own heartbeat. Those footsteps stopped during the quiet between flickers. That is not how people looking for a lost child move through a hallway. The knock was soft, almost polite, which was somehow more frightening than loud would have been. I went to the door. I did not open it. I looked through the peephole. 2 men, both Korean. Both in dark suits that fit them too precisely. Not the suits of men who dressed up for the occasion, but the suits of men who always dressed this way. Both standing with a stillness that people learn rather than carry naturally. The particular stillness of men who are accustomed to waiting, because waiting is part of their work. My hand rested on the doorknob and did not move further. "Who is it?" I asked. One of them said, in careful, practiced English, "We are here for the boy." Inside my chest, 15 things happened at once. "What boy?" I said. A pause, the kind that tells you the person on the other side was expecting a different answer. "The boy you found, we know you have him, we only want to take him home." Home. Something about that word and that voice at that hour made my skin go cold. I said, "I found a child and I called the police immediately. I have a case number. If you have a legal claim to this child, you can present it to the NYPD through proper channels." Another pause, longer. "Mrs. Amaka," the man said. And the fact that he knew my name, my full name, not just a first name, my full name, made the hairs along my arms rise one by one. "Mr. Han would very much like to speak with you. Mr. Han." I filed that name away. "Not tonight," I said. The silence on the other side of that door lasted a long time. Then, "Tomorrow, then, Mr. Han hopes you will accept his invitation." And they were gone. I stood at that door for a full minute after their footsteps faded, listening to my own breathing, listening to the building settle, listening to the small sound of Jihoon shifting in his sleep on my couch. Then I walked to my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and I started looking. I want to tell you about the next 2 hours, because I need you to understand what it felt like to be me, sitting in a small Queens apartment at midnight, searching for the name of the man whose people had just knocked on my door. Han, Korean Organized Crime, New York. I didn't find headlines. I didn't find dramatic exposés. What I found was worse, shadows, references buried in court documents from dismissed cases. A footnote in an investigative piece about business fronts in Flushing that used the phrase, associated entities, in the careful way journalists write when they know more than they can print. A New York Times business section photograph from 6 years before. A charity gala, formally dressed people, and standing slightly apart from all of them. A silver-haired Korean man of perhaps 70 who wore his separation from the crowd the way a king wears a crown without thinking about it, because it has always simply been true. The caption read, Han Seojun, founder and CEO of Hanwell Group, international investment firm. I sat with that photograph for a long time. His eyes gave away nothing. Not coldness exactly. Something more complete than coldness. The eyes of a man who had decided, at some point long ago, that the world would see exactly what he chose to show it and nothing more. Then I looked across the room at Jihoon sleeping, his small chest rising and falling, the rabbit tucked under his chin, his face, in sleep, finally unguarded, just a child, just a little boy. And then the fear arrived, the real fear, not the managed, professional kind I had performed at the door, the kind that lives in the stomach. That makes your hands cold and your thoughts fast and jagged. Amaka asterisk, I said to myself. You are a 51-year-old Nigerian woman with no job, $17, and no one in the city who knows what you're sitting in the middle of. I thought about calling the police again. And then I thought about what the police would do with a black woman who had kept a Korean child in her apartment for 3 days, whose story they had never fully followed up on, who was now claiming that men connected to organized crime had knocked on her door. I thought about how that report would read. I thought about Jihoon waking up tomorrow and looking at me with those eyes. I sat in the dark for a long time, then something settled in me. Not bravery, I want to be clear, it was not bravery. It was something quieter and more stubborn than bravery. The particular stubbornness of a woman who has crossed an ocean alone, buried a child, and spent 6 years keeping strangers' parents alive with her bare hands. I said to myself, tomorrow you're going to look this man in the eye, and you're going to make sure this boy is safe before you let go of him. That's all. That's the whole job. I closed the laptop. I moved my chair to face the couch, and I watched Jihoon breathe until morning came. The call came at 7, a woman, perfect formal English. Mr. Han requested the pleasure of my company at breakfast, an address in Flushing. I said, the child comes with me or I don't come. Silence. Then, of course. The car that arrived at 9 was a black SUV so immaculate it looked as though it had never once touched a real road. The driver didn't speak. Jihoon sat beside me in the back seat with his seatbelt carefully buckled and held my hand the entire way. He didn't look like a child being taken home. He looked exactly the way he had looked beside that dumpster. I held his hand tighter. He pressed his fingers between mine and held on. We drove through Flushing, past restaurants with hanging ducks in their windows, past markets with fruit stacked in precise pyramids, past old men playing cards outside against the October cold, as though cold were simply another opponent to be managed. And then we turned onto a quieter street and stopped before a building that looked, from the outside, like nothing remarkable. A dry cleaning business. But when the driver led us through a side entrance and down a corridor and through a second door, we entered a room that had nothing to do with dry cleaning. A dining room. Long and quiet, a table of dark polished wood set for a formal meal, calligraphy scrolls on the walls. A single large window overlooking a courtyard garden, bare now in October, but shaped in a way that told you it was magnificent in the right season. There was a stone lantern in the center of it, and even without leaves, even without flowers, the garden had a kind of order to it that felt intentional and old. At the head of the table sat Han Seojun. He was smaller than his photograph had suggested. Elderly, precise, silver-haired. He wore a suit with no drama in it that probably cost more than my rent. His hands, folded on the table before him, were the hands of an old man, deliberate, veined, controlled. He looked at me when I entered. Then he looked at Jihoon. Something happened in his face that he tried to control and almost managed. Jihoon, still holding my hand, pressed himself against my side. He did not run to his grandfather. I watched Han Seojun see that. I watched what it cost him. And in that single moment, before a word had been spoken, before tea had been poured, before any of the careful formalities of this strange morning had begun, I understood something about this old man that changed how I would speak to him for the rest of that day. He was not only powerful, he was lonely, and he had not known it until right now, watching his grandson choose a stranger's side over his. We sat. Food came, small, beautiful dishes that I ate carefully and with full attention, because my mother taught me that you do not dishonor someone's table regardless of what you think of them. A young woman sat quietly to the side, the interpreter. Han Seojun spoke to Jihoon in Korean. Jihoon answered in a small voice, still not releasing my hand. The interpreter translated for me in a murmur. He asked if the boy was well, if I had treated him well. Jihoon said yes. He said, and the interpreter's voice was perfectly neutral as she translated, that Amaka made good food even though it was strange. Seojun looked at me for a long moment. He says you fed him well, the interpreter said. He ate well, I said. He wasn't a difficult child at all. Then Seojun spoke again. He asks why you kept the boy. Why you went only to the police and didn't try to contact his family directly. I met Han Seojun's eyes without looking away. Because I didn't know who you were, I said. I found a frightened child alone in the rain with lips turning blue. I am a caregiver by both training and nature. I took him somewhere warm and I contacted the authorities as the law required. Those are all of the facts. And if you had known who we were, I held his gaze, I would have done the same thing, I said, because my obligation was to the child, not to his family name. The silence that followed that answer was long and specific. Han Seojin's eyes did not leave my face. Then he said something in Korean. He says he believes you, the interpreter said quietly. After the meal, Seojin asked staff to take Jihoon to a sitting room to watch television. The boy looked at me with something that was very close to panic. I leaned down to him, to his level, the way I had crouched beside that dumpster 4 days ago. I am going to be right here in this building, I said. I am not leaving without saying goodbye to you, I promise. He searched my face for the lie. He didn't find one. He went. Then Seojin and I sat alone at the long table, and he told me the truth. He told it carefully, without emotion, in the measured way of a man who has survived by never showing more than he intends. But the truth was there underneath the controlled words like a current beneath still water. Jihoon's mother, Min-young, Seojin's daughter-in-law, had fled her marriage 8 months before. His son, Yi-sung, was not, and this lived in the spaces between Seojin's words rather than in the words themselves, a good man. The marriage had begun as an arrangement. Min-young had become afraid. And fear, when it lives in a house long enough, eventually picks up a child and runs. 3 weeks before I found Jihoon, Min-young had been in a car accident. She survived. Barely. She was in a hospital in New Jersey, unconscious. And Jihoon, who had been in the car and had not been physically hurt, had walked away from the scene before anyone could stop him. Because at 4 years old, all he knew was that something terrible had happened, and when terrible things happen, you run. He had been alone for 3 days before I found him. When Seojin finished, the room was very quiet. I said, "How did he eat for 3 days?" Seojin blinked. As though that specific question, the most practical, the most human question, had genuinely not occurred to him. "We don't know," he said. "He's 4 years old," I said. He survived 3 days alone in Queens, and the moment someone sat with him in the rain and offered him a cracker, he accepted it. I paused. That tells you something. Not just about these 3 days, about longer than that. The silence that followed was the longest of our conversation. Han Seojin looked down at his hands on the table. And for one moment, one single, unguarded moment, the composure slipped. He looked like what he was beneath everything else. An old man who had built something vast and somewhere along the way had lost the human things inside it, and who was only now, at 73, beginning to truly count the cost. I was about to speak when the door opened. Yi-sung walked in like a weather system. He had his father's cheekbones and none of his father's stillness. Early 40s. Handsome in a way that had hardened into something else. And the moment his eyes landed on me, everything in his face went to a place I recognized immediately. The place people go when they have decided what you are before you have opened your mouth. He spoke in Korean, fast, clipped, sharp enough to change the temperature of the room. The interpreter went very still. I looked at her. "Please," I said. She looked at Seojin. He gave a small, slow nod. "He asks," she said carefully, "who gave this woman permission to sit at this table. He is asking why his son was left in the care of a..." She stopped. "Go ahead," I said. She kept her voice neutral. "A poor African woman with no family here." I let the words land. I let them sit in the room. I did not look away from Yi-sung. "Your son," I said, "sat beside a dumpster in the rain for 3 days after watching his mother hurt in an accident. He hadn't eaten properly. He was terrified." I sat down in the rain beside him, and I did not ask what his grandfather was worth or what his family name meant. I gave him warm milk and a safe place to sleep. I paused one breath. "You are welcome to be angry about that if it helps you." Yi-sung stared at me with something that moved through contempt and arrived somewhere more complicated. He turned to his father and spoke rapidly. Seojin answered him in a single quiet sentence. 4 words, perhaps 5. Whatever those words were, they hit Yi-sung like a hand pressed flat against his chest. He stopped completely. His jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, not humility, but the recognition that this particular ground was not his to stand on today. He left the room without speaking again. The door closed behind him. Seojin looked at me. I held his gaze and said nothing, because some silences, if you fill them, you ruin them. I thought that was the hardest part. I was wrong. 2 days later, A woman from Child Protective Services came to my apartment with a lawyer I had never met and informed me I was being investigated for the unlawful detainment of a minor. Yi-sung had filed a report. I want to tell you what that felt like, not the summary of it. The actual feeling, because I think you deserve to know, and I think some of you watching this already know it from your own lives. I sat across from that CPS worker in my own kitchen. In the home, I had kept clean and decent on $11.40 an hour, and I watched her eyes move around the room the way a person's eyes move when they are looking for the story they already came in believing. The second-hand couch, the old curtains, the garbage bag I still hadn't fully unpacked because unpacking it meant accepting the job loss was real. She asked me questions in the tone people use when they believe they already know the answers and are simply collecting confirmation. Had I taken the child without permission? Had I restricted his movement? Had I prevented him from contacting his family? I answered every question with complete, documented truth. I showed her the 911 call log with its timestamp. I showed her the police case number. I laid my nursing certification and my home care license on the table between us like evidence of a life she had not bothered to imagine before walking through my door. I was so calm on the outside. On the inside, I was someone else entirely. On the inside, I was a Nigerian woman far from home with no job and $17, who had pulled a blue-lipped child out of the rain, and was now sitting in her own kitchen being investigated for it. On the inside, I was thinking about Emmanuel, not as a tool, not as an explanation for why I did what I did. Just him, just my son, 9 months old and gone, the weight of him, the smell of him. The way he used to grab my finger with his whole fist. I thought, Emmanuel, your mother is in trouble. And I thought, Emmanuel, your mother is not going to break. When they left, I sat on my kitchen floor, not dramatically. Not with weeping and falling. I simply sat down on the linoleum because my legs decided they had been holding me up long enough and it was time to rest. I sat there for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and I called my sister Ngozi. She answered on the second ring. She said, Amaka, just my name, just those 3 syllables in her voice. And something in me that had been locked tight since the elevator at Greenfield, since the bus stop bench, since the knock at midnight, something cracked open. I told her everything, all of it. When I finished, there was a silence from Lagos that crossed all that ocean and still felt close enough to touch. Then Ngozi said, Amaka, you did right. Whatever comes from right, it was still right. You hear me? A pause. Hold your spine straight. I held it. The investigation lasted 11 days. During those 11 days, I did not see Jihoon. I didn't know where he was. I didn't know if he was frightened again. I didn't know if anyone was sitting beside him when he whimpered in the night, or if the rabbit was still with him, or if he had asked for me. I found work cash evenings at a Caribbean restaurant nearby, helping in the kitchen. Not enough, but something. I applied for 3 care positions. I did not sleep well. I thought about Jihoon every single day, not because of the Mafia, not because of the danger. Because he had leaned against my arm on that couch, and I had felt Emmanuel close to me. And some connections, once they form, do not unknit themselves simply because circumstances demand it. On the 11th day, a different lawyer called, not Yi-sung's lawyer, Han Seojan's personal attorney. He said the CPS investigation had been closed, all findings cleared. The original complaint had been formally withdrawn. He said, Mr. Han would like to meet with you again if you're willing. I said, will his son be present? A pause. No, then yes, I said. This meeting was different from the first. No formal table, no ritual of food and formality. Just Seojan in a sitting room with 2 chairs, and the interpreter, and the gray October light coming through a window that looked out onto the courtyard garden with its stone lantern. He looked older than the last time. Or perhaps I was simply seeing him more clearly now, without the architecture of the formal breakfast around him. He said, through the interpreter, I want to apologize for what my son did to you. I said, is Jihoon all right? A pause. Something shifted in the old man's face. You ask about the boy before you accept the apology, he said. The apology can wait, I said. He cannot. Seojan was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. He is with his mother, he said. Minyoung woke from her coma 6 days ago. Jihoon is with her. I closed my eyes. Thank you, I said inside myself, to God, to Emmanuel. To whoever arranges these things. And the rabbit, I said. Siajan looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. It was his mother's gift to him, he said slowly. When she left our house, she bought it herself for him so he would have something of her to hold. And there it was, the thing I had felt but hadn't fully understood. That rabbit was Minyoung. When Jihoon pressed it to his chest in the rain, when he rocked with it after I knocked it off the couch, when he tucked it under his chin in sleep, he was holding his mother. In the only form he had left of her. A 4-year-old boy in a strange city, alone and terrified, pressing his mother to his heart with everything he had. I pressed my hand to my mouth. Then I lowered it and looked at Siajan directly. I'm glad he's with her, I said. Siajan nodded. Then he said something I wasn't prepared for. Tell me about yourself, he said. Not what he could do for me, not the business at hand. Tell me about yourself. So I told him. I told him about Lagos and my mother and nursing school and the borrowed suitcase. I told him about Emmanuel, not as a reason for my choices. As himself, as a 9-month-old boy who grabbed my finger with his whole fist and left a shape in the world when he went that I have carried ever since. I told him about 6 years in Queens. About $11.40, about the garbage bag, about the bench in the rain. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in English directly, without the interpreter for the first time, My wife died 11 years ago. My son became someone I do not recognize. And my grandson was a stranger to me long before he was lost. He looked at the garden. You sat in the rain for a child who had every reason to fear you, he said. He didn't fear me, I said. He feared whatever he had come from. I was just someone who sat down. Siajan turned back to me. And for a man whose face gave away almost nothing, what was in it right then was as close to naked honesty as I think he knew how to get. Now, I need to tell you about Yisung. Because I know you've been waiting for that thread to resolve, and it deserves more than a footnote. 3 weeks after my second meeting with Siajan, I received a call from Siajan's lawyer telling me that Yisung had demanded I be formally banned from any contact with the boy. That he was preparing to make additional complaints, that he was, in the lawyer's careful phrasing, escalating his position. I understood what that meant. I understood that a man like Yisung, whose power rested on controlling what the people around him could access, was experiencing me as a locked door he could not find the key for. And locked doors to men like that become obsessions. I also understood, from things Siajan had said between his careful words, that Yisung's legal position was not as solid as his money suggested. That there were proceedings connected to Minyoung's flight and the circumstances of the marriage that were very much still active. That Yisung's complaint against me had not only been withdrawn, it had backfired. Because the moment his lawyers began examining my 911 call log and the police visit timeline, they also began examining why his own family had not reported Jihoon missing through official channels. Why there had been no Amber Alert. Why 2 men in suits had knocked on my door at midnight rather than a social worker calling at noon. Those questions, once they existed in the legal record, did not go away quietly. I was not there when Siajan confronted his son. I have only what I can piece together from things said to me in the months after, but I know that the confrontation happened. I know that it was not gentle. I know that Yisung, in the end, stepped back from Minyoung and Jihoon's lives, not because he became a different man, but because continuing to fight cost him things he valued more than winning that particular battle. He is still who he is. I hold no illusions about that, but Jihoon and his mother are free. And sometimes that is the only justice that is available. And sometimes, when you have been sitting in the rain long enough, you learn to accept it. Siajan offered me a position. I need to be honest about this part, because I don't want you to think I walked into a fairy tale. He offered it carefully and explained it fully. His company had recently purchased 3 assisted living facilities in Queens and the Bronx. They were understaffed. The quality of care was poor relative to what it should be. He needed someone with real, ground-level experience in elder care to go into those facilities, to be present, to rebuild what had been neglected. The salary he named made me sit very still. I said, "Why me?" he said. "Because you sat in the rain." I said, "That's not a professional qualification." He said, "For most positions, no. For this one, it is the only qualification that finally matters." I looked at him for a long time. I thought about 6 years at 11.40 an hour. I thought about Mrs. Patterson on Hillside Avenue, who used to hold my hand on Friday evenings and say I had the hands of someone's grandmother. I thought about what I knew how to do, not from a management manual, but from years of being the person in the room when no one else could stand to stay. I said, I want a proper contract. Legal employment status, full benefits, authority to hire my own care staff within your parameters. And I want to see Jihoon before I give you my answer. Han Seojun looked at me across the sitting room, then he nodded. I saw Jihoon 2 weeks later. Min-young was still recovering, but she was mobile, and she had agreed to a meeting. She was a small woman with a careful posture and eyes that had processed things and were still working through the aftermath, which I understood without needing it explained. Jihoon came running across the room when he saw me. He ran with the full, uninhibited abandon that children run with when they have decided absolutely that someone is safe. Arms open. No hesitation. He ran into me, and I caught him and held on. I held him the way I had never let myself hold him in those 3 days, because in those 3 days I had been so careful, so professional, so aware of every line I should not cross. Now I held him like what he was, like someone I loved. I felt his heartbeat against my chest, and I said into the top of his head very quietly, "You're okay. You're okay, sweetheart." Min-young stood a few feet away, watching us. After a moment she said, in careful English, "He talks about you. He says Ada, he says Amaka. He says it when he wakes up sometimes. In the night." I looked at her over Jihoon's head. There was a moment between us then, 2 women standing in a room, each carrying losses the other couldn't fully see, each having survived something that had tried very hard to finish her. The particular understanding that exists between women who have protected something small and beloved at great cost to themselves. We didn't need many words. "He was very brave," I said. "For 3 days alone, he was extraordinary." Her eyes filled, she nodded. When Jihoon finally released me, he reached into his little jacket pocket with the serious concentration of someone retrieving something important. He pulled out a peanut butter cracker. He held it out to me on his palm. I looked at it, I looked at his face. And I started laughing, the kind of laughing that has crying woven all the way through it, the kind that comes when your heart is too full to hold only one emotion. I said, "Are you feeding me now?" He grinned at me. His whole face changed with that grin. His eyes disappeared into it. He had a gap where a front tooth was starting to come in, and he looked in that moment like every good thing the world still contains. I took the cracker. I ate it. And something that had been locked in me since a manual, since the borrowed suitcase, since 6 years of arriving before sunrise and leaving after dark, something finally, quietly, opened. That was 4 years ago. I am sitting with you now in an apartment that is larger than the one I had then, not large, but genuinely mine. With a window that catches morning light and a small table where I eat breakfast slowly, because I have finally, at 51 years old, learned to eat slowly. I took the job. The first year was the hardest work of my professional life. 3 facilities, dozens of staff to assess and in some cases replace, budgets that needed fighting for, systems that needed rebuilding from the ground, residents who had been managed but not truly cared for, which are 2 things that look similar from a distance and are nothing alike up close. But I knew how to do it. I had been doing it for 6 years at $11.40 an hour. Now I was doing it at a scale that finally matched the weight of the work. Han Seojun and I met once a month. Those meetings were never easy and always honest, which is, I have come to believe, the only foundation worth building anything on. He was not warm in the way people use that word. He was not a grandfather figure to me, and I was not a daughter to him. We were 2 people who had each survived things that should have ended us, and we respected that in each other with an economy that worked. He told me once, near the end of my first year, that after his wife died, he had not once had a conversation that felt completely honest. "Until the breakfast," he said, I didn't say anything. I understood it. Min-young built a small life in Brooklyn. She began working at a language school. She was careful and deliberate, and constructing something piece by piece, and I recognized the particular care of someone who has had things taken and is now building again with their eyes fully open. She and I see each other, not constantly, not with a formal name attached to what we are to each other, but some Saturdays she brings Jihoon to my apartment and I cook. I make rice and fried egg and dried fish, and she eats it the way he did that very first morning, with full attention, and then looks up for more. Jihoon is 8 years old now, tall for his age. Furiously curious about everything, which is what happens, I think, to children who survive by being very alert. The alertness becomes curiosity once they are finally safe. He asked me last year why I came to get him from beside the trash. I said, because you were crying in the rain and you were alone, and that is not where a person should be. He thought about it with the serious concentration he brings to everything. He said, but you didn't know me. No, I said. So why? I looked at this 8-year-old boy with his enormous dark eyes and his gray rabbit on the shelf behind him, because he no longer carried it everywhere. But it lived on a shelf in his room, because some objects are too important to put away completely. I said, because your heart called to mine, and my heart heard it, and that is enough reason for anything. He accepted that completely. Children, I have learned, are far more comfortable with the truth than we give them credit for. There is one more thing I want to tell you. This past Lunar New Year, I received a card in the mail. From Han Seojun. A small card, expensive paper, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who learned it formally and never forgot. 3 sentences in English, which told me he had written it himself without the interpreter. It said, my wife used to say that people who choose kindness when it costs them something are the only ones worth knowing. I did not understand what she meant for most of my life. I understand it now. Thank you for sitting in the rain. That card is on my refrigerator. Beside it, held up by a small magnet, is a photograph Minyoung sent me. Jihoon in his school uniform, grinning a gap-toothed grin, looking directly at the camera with the particular confidence of a child who knows, in the deepest part of himself, that he is loved. I look at that photograph every morning. I am not a woman who believes in simple answers. Life has been too long and too specific for me to tell you that kindness always keeps you safe, or that doing right always protects you from harm. I know better. I have the evidence written in my own history. But I know this. There are moments in a life when you arrive at a choice that nobody told you was coming. When everything in you that is tired and poor and afraid and bone-weary says, keep walking, and something else, something older, something that lives below thought says, stop, I stopped. Not because I was fearless, because I was my mother's daughter, because I had a manual in my heart, because a little boy was crying in the rain and I had hands. I thought losing my job was the end of my story. I had $17 and a garbage bag and a bench in the rain and nowhere left to go. I did not know that a frightened little boy crouched beside a dumpster was the beginning of the family my heart had never stopped quietly waiting for. God does not always use doors. Sometimes he uses dumpsters, and rain, and a child who calls to your heart without saying a single word. Hold your spine straight, my sister Ngozi told me. I am holding it. I am still holding it. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever stopped when it would have been easier to walk on, if you have ever been the person crying in the rain, if you have ever discovered that the hand reaching toward you belonged to someone you never expected, tell me in the comments. Tell me your story. We are not as alone as this world sometimes makes us feel. And to every person watching who is down to their last $17, wondering if the kindness still in them is something they can afford, it is not a luxury. It has never been a luxury. It is the only thing that has ever truly multiplied. God bless you. And thank you for sitting here with me. Thank you for listening to this story. If it meant something to you, there's more like it here. You're always welcome to come back for more.